going to do today. My main goal is to give you all an understanding of who I am, what my pathway was. You'll also get to put yourself in the shoes of an arts administrator and equity worker, and I hope will give me some ideas for how to do my job a little bit better. So you see an agenda down there. We will have some breakout room time so that you guys, so that you all have a chance to connect and kind of decompress about what you're hearing. We'll have a group discussion, we'll come back together, and of course, a Q&A session. A couple quick notes, again, more logistics about our time together. First things foremost, this is our time, not just mine, meaning that if there is any point that you have a question or concern or you're confused about something, please feel free to unmute and just ask that question. The goal really is to make this as useful as possible for you. I really encourage the step up, step back method. If you're someone who steps up a lot and kind of speaks more, encourage you to use this time to maybe step back, and the opposite for if you're someone who doesn't speak as much. Be here now, which is incredibly difficult in pandemic times, I'm totally aware, but just for what it's worth, if you can be as present as possible, that'd be really great so that we can make the most use of our time together. Stay open and flexible. You might get called on. Please don't feel like that you need to answer a question if I call on you. You can always pass. Be ready to use the chat. You'll see throughout that I have prompts so that you all hear from each other and not just from me. So let's dive in. A little bit about me, and before I say that, in the chat, if you can please put your name, your instrument, and one word to describe who you were at the age of 13. So for me, I'm Angelica Cortez, as you already know. My instrument was actually the trumpet. I studied trumpet performance, which I'll talk a little bit more about. And at 13, I would say I was extremely responsible. So that's my word, responsible. So as far as who I am, a lot of my work is centered around questions. And a lot of my job, I think, is to find the right questions and to ask the right questions. These three are really a bit of a driving force that I come back to constantly. It's who am I, who are my people, and what do I want? So to dive into that, you already know my name. I use she, her pronouns. I also identify as Chicana, which just means that I'm Mexican American, and also that I was born here in the US. I identify as queer, and you're also looking at very cute photos of my parents. So that top left photo is actually my favorite picture of my mom and dad. They are, I think, 14 and 17 in that picture, and had just found out that I was pregnant. So they were super young when they had me. And the reason I tell you all of this is so that you understand the lenses that I wear as I move through the world. And I think part of my job is making sure that people can bring their fullest selves into the spaces that they walk into, specifically in orchestral settings, where at times there's not really space for us to bring our full identities in. So part of me sharing this is because I want all of you to have an understanding of the lenses that I wear and how that impacts the way that I view the world, and also to lead by example in that I want you all to have a full picture as possible in relation to who I am. See what else? Outside of music, I have several other practices, including teaching, which is why I'm speaking here with you today, running, writing, reading. As far as my people go, my people are those that actively work toward a more equitable world. And my people are here to practice. My people are here to learn. And if I were to boil it down to one sentence for my mission, it would be to create more equitable, diverse, and just spaces in the arts. That's a little bit about me and who I am. And if nothing else, you've now seen very good photos of what LA looked like in the 90s. So as we were preparing for this conversation, Aiden and Christine both mentioned that it might be helpful to hear a little bit about my pathway. So before I tell you a little bit about that, you heard a little bit about my questions in the last slide. If you can, in the chat, type your current major and also an essential question for you in your field. So what's one big question that drives you as it relates to your major or your work for the future, yeah? So as far as a little bit about me and my pathway and journey here, I studied trumpet performance. I minored in education. I got a master's degree in teaching. I graduated from UC Davis, so that's where I studied trumpet and music, trumpet and education a little bit more broadly. And actually, after I graduated from UC Davis, I was looking at options between like, do I go to graduate school? Do I, take a break for a little while and try and figure out my next move? I was playing, I was gigging, I wasn't really sure necessarily what to do next. And so I wound up deciding to take a break and ended up moving back in my parents' place and really desperately needed to make money. So was taking literally any gig I could. And teaching wise was really teaching everything and anything I could. So that was trumpet classes, brass classes. I was teaching even SAT prep classes, literally anything that came my way. I was like, yep, I'm available. I'm going to go do that. And as I started to do that, I really started to fall in love with teaching. And specifically, what would happen as I was teaching was that there would be students who would kind of like look at me and be like, do you speak Spanish? So I felt like I was kind of getting spotted and seen in a very strange way. As you can see, I have light skin, so I don't necessarily read as Mexican to a lot of people because of that. And it always felt really special when students ask, like, who are you? Like, what's your deal? The other question that I got was like, how old are you? Because I was like very fresh out of college. So I really, what I loved about that was when students would actually start to tell me that, that it was rare that they met someone in a teaching position that spoke Spanish, or it was rare, that they had the chance to really converse with someone in a really casual way. As you can see in my teaching setting, I'm very much me. So I'm trying to create as inclusive of a space as I can. And I found that read really well, especially with high school students. And I really just started to fall in love with watching students kind of have those like really magical moments of, oh my gosh, I get it now. I see what I'm doing here. So I taught and taught and taught for a really long time, or at least what felt like a really long time, at the same time that I was getting my master's degree in teaching. Then ended up working at the Los Angeles Philharmonic on a program called YOLA, which I'll tell you all about. And I think I'm 6 weeks in. Yeah, so 6 weeks ago, I started my new job at the Juilliard School. In addition to that, I am a member of the Sphinx Lead Cohort, which is a program that aims to help people of color find executive level positions in the arts. So that's sort of how I wound up here. It really was a combination of teaching, gigging. Honestly, it was a lot of knocking on people's doors too. And kind of being like, hey, I'm available, I'm around. If you need something, please let me know. And I think as far as teaching goes, a couple of the things that helped me as I was teaching really start to find my interests and find my passions were centered around I started realizing as I was teaching how kind of actively inequitable classrooms could be, right? So when you're looking at power in a classroom, all the power usually resides with the person who's giving information, right? I'm here lecturing to you, or if you're in for me, I was thinking about trumpet lessons specifically. I'm here to sort of study from someone who is essentially a gatekeeper. This person is given authority as the person with knowledge and power in the room. They're going to pass that power on to me. They're going to pass that knowledge on to me. And then I became a teacher and I became a gatekeeper. So that for me sparked a little bit of interest. It was like, I started wondering what I could do about that dynamic and started wondering how we could start to shift that and really just started asking questions. So I say this to you because I want to encourage you to kind of think about your I don't knows. And that for me was like an I don't know. I remember realizing that I'd become a gatekeeper as I started giving private lessons. And I thought, I don't know about this. I'm not sure what this means. And so I would encourage you to kind of think about that and think about what your I don't know is. I'm going to go on to the next slide. I'm going to take 1 second to take a look at the chat. We've got tons of awesome questions in here and I'm loving that. Christine and Aiden, just let me know if you think you see something that I need to pause for. So let me tell you a little bit about my work on YOLA and at YOLA National. Hopefully you all got to see the video that I sent. thumbs up, thumbs down on the video? Yeah, awesome. So you have a little bit of a sense of what the program is now, but I'll give you, and what you actually heard was really students, staff, and our conductor, Gustavo Dudamel, who I'm sure you all know. You may have heard of him. He's you know, it's really amazing watching him walk into a crowd because it's truly like a very instant sort of, I've never seen it with a conductor in particular, but like it's like watching students see Brad Pitt for the first time or something. It's insane. In any case, so to give you my perspective on what the program is, YOLA is a youth development through music program. So what that means is that the goal of the program is really to use music as a tool for youth development purposes, right? So we're not there necessarily for the sake of art, we're there for the sake of the young people who are in the room. If you were to talk to Gustavo Dudamel about the program, he would argue that the mission of the program is actually social change in our society through music, right? So he really put it pretty big. The other thing that I'll just say in relation to that is that we were often thinking about sort of transferable skills, right? So we wanted to make sure that the students who were in our programs were actually getting skill sets that they could take on with them into other facets of life, in the same way that I'm sure that you all think about music, right? And how you're learning, how can I apply what I'm learning about how I learn my instrument in environmentalism or whatever else it is that you all are studying. The program has a local component that serves 1,200 students, and it also has a national component that serves several hundred more. And the biggest thing about this program, of course, is that it is completely free. The students and parents do not pay anything for any aspect of their programming. The instruments that they get are free. Any trips that they go on are totally free. So that's obviously a key aspect of the program. On a practical level, just to give you a sense of like, what does that mean? What does your day-to-day look like? In that position, my day involved literally anything from jumping in and teaching a trumpet lesson to taking kids across the country and figuring out how to get them from, you know, the airport to their hotel to, you know, wherever it was that they were going, thinking about aspects of, you know, how do I make sure that the percussion is set up when they get to Mexico. And of course, with travel, a big issue that came up often was how do we make sure that we're traveling with students who may have sensitive documentation issues or whose parents may have sensitive documentation issues, right? And so how do I make sure that students and parents both feel safe as they're traveling across the country? And how do I make sure that that along every step of the way, our students feel comfortable sharing any information that's pertinent? So it's really about relationship building in that sense as well. Also, of course, producing large scale concerts. So, you know, everything from getting kids on and off stage to making sure that the orchestra is set in the right way. So really, you know, my work at YOLA, I'm super grateful for it because I got to wear a lot of different hats and sort of try a lot of different things on. And then the last thing that I think was really big and important about this job is, of course, fundraising. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But the essential question for me in my work at YOLA and YOLA National was, how do I use orchestral music as a tool for social justice when so much of the structure and the history of orchestral music is antithetical to equity and justice? So you can think here, and I know that you've spoken with Garrett and Titus, and I'm sure they've given you tons of ideas on how inequity shows up in orchestras. But really, I mean, everything from the setup of an orchestra, right? The fact that within an orchestra, we have associate principals, and a conductor. That's an inherently hierarchical structure, right? That is not equity based. And so that even just that basic fundamental thing is like, kind of, how am I supposed to use this as a tool for social change or as a tool for equity when that structure exists? And of course, we know that the historically the composers that we play are not people of color, and this is a program mostly for Black and Latino students. So there are a lot of issues there that were what my colleague LaCoy in Washington calls competing truths. So these are sort of tensions that popped up on my day-to-day basis. And it's not that, you know, one thing is more true than the other, they just coexist. So it is both a fact that YOLA is a tool for social justice or a program that offers young people really huge opportunities. It is also true that YOLA is a fundraising mechanism for the Los Angeles Philharmonic, right? I can promise you that there's nobody in the development office that hasn't talked about YOLA as they're requesting donations in their philanthropy work. So both of those things were true, and part of my work was really living with those two tensions and trying to find a happy medium to make sure that our mission was upheld, and also that the economic health of our program was working. So all that makes sense? Any questions so far? Cool. A couple of the key practices that kind of came up, anti-adultism. So part of the reason that I asked you to put your age, word to describe yourself at that age is trying to get you to think back to when you were 13, right? A lot of times within the sphere of classical music specifically, quote unquote classical music specifically, we don't really put ourselves in the shoes of the learner. And often there is a teacher and there is a learner rather than a sort of co-beneficial relationship, right? So adultism, you know, you've probably heard of the term ageism, and a lot of times that refers to the idea that older folks are treated inherently unfairly. Adultism refers to the idea that young people are actually silenced most often, and especially in classrooms. So if you think about even the fact that you have to ask to go to the restroom, right? As a young person in a classroom, in any other setting, you would never ask an adult to do that. You would allow adults, like if we were sitting together in a room, I would never expect you to raise your hand to go to the restroom. I have an unearned privilege as an adult when I walk into a room that allows me to move about the world as however I want to. I didn't do anything other than be born at a specific time to earn that privilege. Young people didn't do anything to you know, put themselves in the situation that they are when they walk into a classroom. And especially in Black and brown schools, or predominantly Black and brown schools, there's a lot of adultist practices that show up that actually mean that young people are silenced. So we really worked a lot with our teachers to kind of spot the moments that came up and really tried to make sure that we didn't think of the students as these sort of like empty vessels that we're pouring information into. And a lot of times in education, that's kind of how we're treated as students, is we are the empty vessels that we're being poured into. And actually, the best way for students to learn is for them to have a relationship and a learning space where they're also teachers, right? So that's a big practice that we thought a lot about in my work in YOLA and YOLA National. Anti-racism, of course, showed up and was something that we were doing quite a bit of training, especially as I left, in and around for our teachers. And then, of course, you're hearing me talk a lot about this idea of power sharing. So to give you a little bit of a sense of what I'm doing now at the Juilliard School, and again, while I'm doing this, I have a little in the chat for you. So my title at the Juilliard School is Manager for Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging. So my question to you is, if you were to come up with a new term for an equity manager, quote unquote, what would it be and why? Part of why I'm asking this is because a lot of times in equity work, there's like a lot of words thrown around that become really fruitless and kind of meaningless. I think equity is starting to kind of become one of those terms. So just curious to hear your thoughts. If you have any creative ideas, mostly so that I can stop saying equity, diversity, inclusion, and belonging. That would be great. But also just curious to hear your thoughts. You know, is justice a word that belongs in that title? Is anti-racism a word that belongs in that title? So go ahead and put that in the chat if you have any ideas there. So on a practical level, what does it look like to be an EDIB manager at the Juilliard School? There's a few big projects. Again, I'm only 6 weeks in, so I'm still learning, and I'm sure I'll have a totally different story to share when I'm a year in. But in any case, as it as of right now, some of the things that we're working on, we just created a bias response office, which was a request made by our student body actually, and a big call from our student body was that, you know, they wanted a more formal process and a more formal way to report on incidents related to bias. And so we have an office has been established, there are procedures being put in place. And I think a big issue there too is that what's interesting with like Title IX and bias incidents is that there's like policy violations that are directly violations of a policy. And then there's also these sort of like not exactly policy related issues, but like things that happen that might be a microaggression that don't necessarily directly you know, hit the policy, but still need some resolution. And so we're trying to come up with solutions for both so that when a student feels that they've been harmed in a classroom by something that came up in class, that there is some kind of resolution process for them and that they feel like they can talk about it and find a solution for it. So that's a big undertaking and obviously involves a lot of things related to our legal department, et cetera. In addition to that, we're facilitating discussion with students, staff, and faculty about the types of workshops related to EDIB that they would like to take place this year. So we're working with them to make sure that whatever it is that we offer them are things that they find relevant and also are things that they are more practically able to do in their classrooms or and in their art forms, right? We've launched a foundational workshop for all of our staff and faculty. So all of our staff and faculty now get trained on EDIB as they're hired. We're also in the middle of creating some guidelines that aim to impact our curriculum. So for example, we're trying to put some policies in place that mean that when students play in juries and recitals, that they are required and encouraged to perform music by composers of color and composers who are underrepresented, female composers, right? So that our repertoire is not just Eurocentric. And then another thing that's sort of coming up a lot in my first few weeks is thinking about institutional messaging. So, you know, anything from what is the appropriate response when massive sort of events take place. So for example, when the murder of George Floyd took place this past year, there's a lot of questions about what is the correct response from the institution, right? And what's appropriate. Another example, and this is like a really small example, but is social media, right? It's Black History Month. How do we as an institution and as a predominantly white institution specifically, right? How do we make sure we celebrate this way in a way that's authentic and meaningful and not just trying to show face? So that's another thing that kind of comes up. And just to give you some insight on like why I took a new position, for me personally, it was really about a couple of different things. One was that I was really excited about actually getting to focus really specifically on equity in the arts. And another, right, because at my last job, it was, I was working at a presenting organization, meaning the LA Phil's mission actually as a whole was about the LA Phil Orchestra and about performing concerts, right? And I happened to work for an educational part of that institution that I would say is a really core aspect to that institution, but the sole purpose of the LA Phil is not education. Whereas at Juilliard, the sole purpose of that institution, of this institution is to educate. So really excited about that. I was also really excited about getting to look into different art forms. And I think there's a lot of potential crossovers between dance, arts, and music. So really excited about that. And the kind of essential questions that I'm looking at here are, what does equity, quote unquote, look like in one of the most prestigious and exclusive colleges in the country, right? I think we have a 7% acceptance rate last I checked. So what does it mean to build a more equitable program in this setting? Another question that pops up so far is, what are the structures in place that prevent equity in our curriculum and in our varied art forms, right? What is Juilliard's responsibility on a national scale? We're aware that as one of the major arts institutions, we have a responsibility, but where does that start and where does that stop is a big question, I think. And what art forms are valued, what art forms are not valued, and why. And I think that this shows up quite a bit in our curriculum, right? Whose music is being played, whose music is not being played, and why. So those are all the kind of questions that are just starting to bubble up. Okay, so that was, how did I do? I did 25 minutes, I didn't do terrible. So we're gonna go ahead and go into breakout rooms that you all have a chance to just kind of decompress. Just a couple of quick reminders. Please refer to our agreements when you go into these discussion groups. And if as a group, here, I'm gonna stop sharing. We all able to access the slides, okay? Okay, perfect. Great, so if you all don't mind, just, here we go, sorry. As a group, if you can choose the questions you'd like to focus on, I'm gonna encourage you to pick at least one scenario. You'll see the questions in the next slide, but pick at least one scenario that you wanna talk through. Of course, you can do both if you want to. But I'd really like you all to try and, kind of take a walk in my shoes, so to speak, with your own lenses on and try and talk through that as a group. Also, if you could designate someone as a note taker and designate someone or a couple people to share out, that would be really helpful, because when we come back, it would be great to just be able to kind of flow through all the groups. When we go into breakout rooms, it should tell you what room you're assigned to, like group 1, 2, 3, or 4. And if you look at the next couple of slides, you'll see group 1, 2, 3, 4. So feel free to use that space to type in any notes that you want to jot down or anything like that. Anything else? I also left the videos in there in case you didn't get a chance to see them. And the last thing, of course, is these questions are my guide. By all means, let the conversation flow. They're really just to give you a starting point. Make sense? Okay, so we'll be in breakout rooms for between 10 and 15 minutes, and we'll try to give you a warning before we come back together. Aiden and Christine, you all good?
Yep, people
Cool.
should have their breakout rooms now.
Perfect. Nice, look at that, that flowed so smoothly.
All right, take it away.
All right, everyone, welcome back. I think we still have just a few people trickling in, so I'll give that another second. I think we're all back. Great. So hopefully you all had a chance to kind of engage with each other on some of these questions. Would love to hear from each of the groups. So maybe I'll just go in order since that's easiest in terms of the flow. So group 1, why don't you just talk us through some of the highlights of your conversation and some of the things that popped up as you were talking about the scenarios and the questions.
I think group 1 actually just returned, so maybe they didn't hear
that. Sorry about that, group 1. Put you on the spot and you didn't even know it. Group 1, in case you missed it, if you can just give us your highlights from what you all discussed and talk us through the things that came up as you were talking about the scenarios.
So we discussed scenario 1 and some things that we thought were important in terms of like a gala, providing transportation, a dress code that everyone can abide to, space, ensuring that the performers aren't nameless, and having free food is also nice. And then for the questions, so what resonated in terms of the presentation, something we brought up was the chat exercises. This was like kind of new compared to the last 2 times we were in a meeting and someone came to speak to us. And I thought that helped engage us kind of like in some other lectures where we have like breakout rooms and stuff too. And then when it comes to, For question 2, when it comes to equity, we had a group member who's in the like STEM field, and they brought up how that it's male dominated and how it's important for there to be equal opportunities for everyone. I think that, yeah, that's pretty much what we had.
Fantastic. Thanks, Group 1. And I'll talk through some of my experience with scenario 1 too, but let's go ahead and move on. Thank you very much for that. And let's hear from Group 2.
I guess I can kind of go over what we talked about. So we kind of did a more informal thing where we just kind of talked about some of the questions, we discussed them. We really focused on the question of what art forms are valued, which ones aren't valued, and why. And I guess we looked more at how the arts are usually not valued, even though they might be presented like they are. Because, like, for example, in high schools, arts programs are usually the first to be cut if there's budget constraints. And then we talked about how there's kind of this, like one of the examples we gave was like orchestra versus band in high school, how that kind of creates rifts in music. And then the idea of like classical versus pop music, where some classical musicians might say that pop music isn't music, while pop musicians think that classical music might be boring or just archaic. And that kind of keeps the arts from unifying. And I think that that's one of the reasons why it's hard to see for some people to see the value in art, because there's so many different opinions and ideas that it's hard to consolidate them. Then we talked about scenario 2, and some of the advice that we were thinking of was that, well, highlight and share information about different female artists within different genres of music. And then we talked about how they should look into their own organization and look at how much gender and sex fairness there is within the different circles of management, the actual performances, programming and hiring, and then essentially just challenge the institution to hire more women identifying musicians, to program more female artists, and to ensure that there's fair workplace practices. Yeah, and I guess about the presentation, we all really liked the chat questions and the conversations. It engaged us more, and it kind of kept it more personal between ourselves and speakers, and that's something that we haven't really had much lately, so we really like that. And we like the accessibility of the slides and being able to have access to the questions and information.
Wow, there's so much substance in what you were talking about there. I'm gonna touch on one thing because I won't touch on this again, and that's this idea of what you framed it as classical versus pop music, right? And the way most musicians study music, especially at university, right, is through the lens and frame of quote unquote classical music, right, which inherently places value on orchestral and classical music. So everything that we learn, including like music theory, and there's a great article by Philip Ewell, I'll put his name in the chat, but about how of the 7 most used music theory textbooks, I think something abysmal, like 1% are of the composers and examples used in music theory textbooks are people of color or women. 1%, it's abysmal. And in addition to that, when we're talking about pop music, while pop music is a bigger sort of part of the pie in relation to like music sales and music revenue, we as musicians don't really learn how to analyze pop music or rap music, right? We learn a lot about how to analyze music on a vertical and horizontal setting, right? You learn about the chords and the structures and the harmonies. We don't learn about things like lyrics. We don't necessarily learn about the complexities of rhythm in the same way. So to your point, when we're talking about value, right, there is a value put on classical music that there is not put on pop music. And I like what you said too, what you were pointing to in and around the arts in general more broadly kind of not being valued. Because there's certainly a lot of questions as to why does equity matter in orchestral music, right? Especially when we're talking about 1% of music sales, or I'm sorry, it's 3% of music sales overall that go toward orchestral music. But the reality is orchestras are capital, right? Orchestras are part of a giant nonprofit system, right? And so this is just one small piece of a really large arts sector and an even bigger not-for-profit sector. So lots to think about there. And thank you so much, Group 2, for all of that conversation. I'll stop now. Group 3.
Great. So for scenario 1, we had pretty much the same list of things as Group 1, actually, just more so making sure that the musicians are being treated as well as guests. So it's not just that they're performers. We were talking about how a lot of us had similar experiences where we've been people that are not guests at these events in various services, being photography or actually playing music, things like that. And yeah, just making sure they're all fed, making sure that students are recognized by name, and having staff provide resources, especially things like mics and things that people don't tend to think about, like adequate space for like moving around, stands, etc. And then we also talked about scenario 2, and the main thing that we were talking about there was that the things that are being posted with social media, the main thing is that they can't just be performative. It's really great to educate people about these things, and we were also talking about some of the ways that you can do that, especially having something interactive with your posts, something like trivia or stuff like that, that is more likely to get people to engage. But the main thing there is that you can't just post about it on social media. You actually have to see some sort of concrete changes within the organization to back it up. In terms of the presentation, we also really like the chat responses, and we really like that you touched on adultism, since that's something that we've all experienced, but that's something that usually doesn't come up. We were talking about specifically within our fields, there are a couple specific instances, but what we were noticing is that in a lot of ways, they all tend to be the same across fields. You see the same sorts of systemic barriers to higher education, especially cost is a big one of them, and resources to actually getting there. And then finally, the last thing we talked about was the Sphinx video. And we were talking specifically about, so a lot of things have improved to some extent since 2017, but one thing that hasn't in a way that's big enough to make a difference, we think, is that Black and Indigenous people of color, they feel like they're pressured to tone themselves down. And that's something that's still relevant in 2021 for a lot of minorities. But contrary to that, we think it's really important actually for people to be able to see in the field people who represent and inspire you. So that's what we talked about.
Yeah, again, so much good substance there. And really glad to hear that you all had a chance to take a look at the Sphinx video. I imagine you saw some familiar faces, if I remember right, from your last chat. So thank you so much, Group 3. How about we move straight into Group 4?
Okay, we talked about the first scenario as well, and we thought that in like involving all students in the process, like not just the people who are performing, but like doing some sort of score reading or some other method of learning about the music being performed would be a way to have everyone benefit from the experience. And some questions we had for staff were, is there a dress code? Because again, that's potentially exclusionary. And another thing we would ask is how much freedom do students have in their performance, such as what kind of music are they allowed to pick, and are they allowed to choose whatever music they'd like to perform, because having more freedom or control of their performance leads to like a more enriching and personalized experience of it. We were also thinking about asking if the students could have a more prominent role in the fundraiser, like the students' performances specifically. So instead of just having them play sort of background music, have some sort of attention drawn to them, like maybe putting them on a stage or announcing the performance and making it clearly shown and making it a centerpiece instead of just in the background. And also, what roles can they have in the event besides just performing? Because otherwise, they might just be kind of sitting around the whole time. And maybe having them be able to help out with other aspects of the event other than just performing can help them be enriched in other ways as well. And so we also talked a little bit about what resonated from the presentation, which we thought about the thoughtful consideration for students and acknowledgement they aren't just knowledge sponges. They have something to offer back to the classroom and everything. And we also kind of resonated with the confrontation of harmful hierarchies in classical music and making sure that it's kind of by nature a very hierarchical institution, and recognizing that and confronting it is very important. We kind of all agreed on that.
I'm really happy to hear a couple of groups talk about adultism as a helpful concept. I think adultism for me is a particularly great lens to look at inequity through, because most people, I would even say probably everyone, has experienced some version of adultism, of being silenced because you're a kid, whether it's your mom or dad just telling you no because I said so, or being in a classroom and really feeling like you have something that you feel is unjust, right? Or I have this idea, this thing that I want to say, and I'm just not being heard. And I think that if we look at this particular ism as a means or as a lens to kind of see other isms through, it's a really interesting concept. So just more food for thought on that. Thank you all. It sounds like you all had really great conversations. Let's go ahead and I'll be on slide 14, but if you all want to head over to slide 15, that's just another opportunity for a share out. If you all don't mind picking a sticky, obviously be mindful of other folks on their stickies and just write one key takeaway that you are going to leave with today. That'd be great. And as you do that, I'll talk through my kind of final thoughts in terms of next steps and what can you do from here. And just to circle back to those two first scenarios, obviously those are things that I come up against and came up against every single day. And what's interesting about that first scenario, right, is everything that you all were describing are just things that you would do for a normal human, like an adult, right? And for some reason, when it comes to education settings and when you're working with kids, we for some reason lose sight of the kids as just other people who we should treat like other human beings, right? And make sure that they're well fed, make sure that they feel seen and heard, make sure that they have an opportunity to ask questions. And also there's absolutely no reason to me in a gala setting or in a donor event setting that the students shouldn't know what they're walking into, right? And that the students shouldn't have an opportunity to say, I feel good about this, I don't feel good about this. Actually, I don't want to do this event because this doesn't quite feel right to me. So for us, it really was about making sure you presented the students with a full picture so they knew what they were walking into, why they were doing it, and also that if anyone ever felt uncomfortable, they were allowed to say no. And there is a really important aspect here of making sure that there's a culture in which the students feel like they can say no, right? But all of the other things that you all mentioned, food, water, transportation, are they getting paid? Those are super legitimate, great questions to be asking. And of course, the other question, exactly what you were, the other scenario, exactly what you all were saying. You want to make sure that as an institution, if you're putting things up on social media, especially, that you actually have, sort of action steps in place to back that up, and that you're being mindful as a large institution, right? Especially right now, I think there's a lot of good reason for folks to be calling out major arts institutions like Juilliard and saying, I don't know about your last post. I don't know about what you're doing here. And I think that there's good reason for folks to ask questions, and there's good reason for us as Juilliard to make sure that we have examples of what we're doing beyond Women's History Month to honor and celebrate women in art, right? So those are some kind of final thoughts there. What can you all do in terms of equity, inclusion, diversity, belonging? Look for any opportunity to create equity in every aspect of what you do. And I really do mean look for opportunities, and as crazy as it might drive you, really just ask a lot of questions. Everything that I do really isn't about finding answers, it's about asking the right questions. So really want to encourage that. Better understand the lenses that you wear and how they impact your view of the people that you engage with. I think that this is the most critical thing that we as individuals can do, is really understand who we are. You really can't change some of the things that you are, and you really can't change some of the things that you grew up with, and that's okay. But what you can do is understand those things, and what you can do is start to try and unpack the things that may create bias in your life, and also understand that we are biased, period. That is just a fact. There is nobody that is not biased. We all have lenses that we wear, that we carry with us, and so it's our job to just kind of unpack those lenses. And of course, I can't recommend Ibram Kendi's writing enough. How to be an anti-racist, and the kind of fundamental concept there is that there's no such thing as I am not racist. You are either actively practicing against racism or you are not. And I think, to me, that goes back to that question approach, right? So rather than assuming you know the answer, really trying to question it. And then ask questions about what is and isn't valued in your field. This, I think the reason that I love studying equity in orchestra settings so much is that it's one example of what you all were pointing to earlier, what many other fields are facing. So, if we can create more equity in a space like orchestral music, then I think we're pretty well set up to do that in other spaces. In any case, that's my presentation for the day. I think we have a couple minutes. How are we do on time? Yeah, we have a couple minutes for Q&A. Thank you all so much. I'll pass it over to Christine and Aiden in case there are any questions. Thanks.
Yeah, so if you guys have questions like right now, you can send them in the chat to everyone, or to either me, Aiden, or Angelica, or you can speak up if you feel like it. There is one question that I really liked in particular from the Canvas discussion that I wanted to highlight. And Lindsay, that was your question. So if you feel comfortable.
Yeah, sure. So after watching the Sphinx video, it stuck out to me that several of the panelists talk about having to tone themselves down to fit in with their white counterparts, and Joan already touched on this, and I had resonated with that personally as a queer Latinx person, having to tone myself down in orchestral spaces and also like STEM spaces for me. So I was wondering if you can talk about that, and maybe also how things have changed since that was from 2017, if you feel like we've moved towards accepting people for how they are more and not toning down so much, or if that's still the case.
That's such a great question. Thank you so much for that. It's really interesting having worked with young people. I will say that young people are much better at not code switching than like my generation is. So I'm 30 years old. And in my generation, and I shouldn't speak broadly, I'll say that in my own life, I certainly found myself code switching quite a bit. I am one version of Angelica Cortez at the Juilliard School, and I'm a very different version of Angelica Cortez at home with my parents, when there's mariachis in the background and, all this other stuff happen. So I would say that that's still a very critical issue. However, I will say that I think young people in particular are doing an amazing job of kind of pressing against that and starting to question, like, why do I need to be different in those different spaces? Why do I need to adjust to this culture? Like, there's actually not a sufficient reason for it. There's a great podcast actually called Classically Black Podcast that's led by Delaney Harris. If you haven't heard of it, please go check that out. It's fantastic. But that's, I think, an example of a space that was created by and for Black people, right? And the more spaces we have like that, the better off our culture will be. The other thing I'll say is the more fully, and this is why I talked about me at the beginning of this session, right? The more I can be fully me in the spaces that I walk into and not just kind of immediately adapt, the better our culture will be. And we have to remember too that culture is created by groups and by people. We'll talk a lot about Juilliard as an institution. Juilliard is people. And so the more people of color that step into the Juilliard campus, the more different that culture becomes. So that's why diversity, I think, is such a critical issue. That's why, and they talked about that in the Sphinx video too, right? It does matter that Black and brown bodies are, and dark skin is physically present in the school. I'll also say to that being a Latina with light skin has a very different implication than like my sister and my brother who have dark skin. We have very different, and that goes back to bias and goes back to some of the more fundamental questions. We had very different life experiences and lived experiences because of that difference. So that's a long-winded answer to your question, but I would say that it still is a critical issue, and that it is really up to all of us to be the fullest versions of ourselves and not kind of adapt to the culture that exists. And it's a hard thing to do. It's a hard thing to work against.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
It doesn't look as though we have any other questions right now, but we have a lot that we got from the discussion board that was on Canvas. One that Christine and I actually noticed a lot of people asked about was specifically regarding inspiring children. So the questions, we got a lot around the topic, but just sort of trying to piece them all together into one question. It was asking about how, you're working with kids a lot. How do you get them inspired to practice music and go out on their own, especially knowing that a lot of these kids may have hardships that they face in their home life and everyday life?
Yeah, that is such a great question. There's a lot to unpack in that. So one thing that I'll say is our program was optional, right? Meaning that students vote with their feet. So I'll say that the first thing as a teacher, if you're not asking, and my colleague Phil always says this, if you have students not showing up to your classroom and you're wondering why they're not showing up, but not asking yourself that question, there's an issue, right? Like, if our program is not worthy of our students' time, then that's not our students' fault, that's our fault. The responsibility and the onus is on us to make sure that whatever it is that we're creating is for the people that we are trying to serve. So for us, that question is about us and about what we're programming. That means looking at repertoire. Maybe our students think our repertoire is boring and they don't want to play Ode to Joy anymore, right? And that's a legitimate thing. And if the goal and purpose of our program is to serve young people, then we need to look at why they're not showing up. And we don't need to look at them or what their issues are. We need to look at us. The other end of that, of course, is that one of the key inequities in orchestral music is the amount of time and financial resource it requires, right? So part of motivation, I would say, intrinsic motivation, quote unquote, I would say is also about priorities. And we as a program need to understand that, especially working with young people from historically marginalized communities, we have to understand that there are going to be competing priorities. And again, the question comes back to us. What do we have in place that allows students to balance and juggle those competing priorities, right? What do we have set up in place so that students do have a place to practice and do have time to practice? I can tell you that a number of our students are, in one single room with like 2 or 3 brothers and sisters all trying to do Zoom at the same time. That's not their fault. That means that we've got to do something to help them figure out how to find a space to practice. So it's, again, if you're looking at all of this through an equity lens, as much as we want to blame the students, it's really the onus is on us. And to some degree there, you can't be everything to anyone, and I'm not saying that we have to be, but we can ask a lot of questions about what we can do to support those students rather than question them and their motivations.
So it is 6:09, almost 6:10, and I know Chris wants to get those photos. And also we had one announcement that we forgot to mention earlier, which is we will have more guests come in, and Chris really wants to encourage all of us, if we're interested, to just like reach out for any guests that in particular we like individually are interested in, to talk to them before, after the session, you know, get to know them. Chris, was that right? And also, do you want to do the photos?
Yeah, well, first, can we just say a thank you to Angelica for her wonderful presentation. Also to Christine and Aiden for doing such a magnificent job as first student moderators. They really were fantastic. So let's all give them a hand. I'm starting to form up plans for our phase 2 score study online sectional. So these take form in many different speakers and coaches and master classes. So for example, there will be a guitar master class, there will be a horn master class, there will be violin sectionals, there will be percussion sectionals. So even though the sectional portion online is very specific to your part assignment, it is open for all members to observe and take part in. The scores, when we have speakers such as Carl Sinclair come and do and talk about Bernstein, you know, that's going to be such a not specifically just towards the Bernstein Halil that we're playing, but just to meet him as a person and his experiences. So all of those sessions will be open. So for all these sessions, we would love to have student moderators. So I'll start to post them as the schedule is confirmed. Some of the dates we're still going back and forth in terms of the availability of our guests. So look for the confirmation of schedules if you're interested in being a student moderator. Let's take that picture. I'll stop recording.